A wall of wild horses surging through western Germany looks almost mythic, but the bigger story today is what happens when force, control, and free movement collide in the real world. On the sea lanes, in war zones, and even in politics, somebody always wants to put a gate where the rest of us thought there was open ground. Good morning, and welcome back to Daily. Today's roundup has that same pattern running through almost everything: who gets to control the route, who gets to set the rules, and who pays when the system gets it wrong. We start with one of the strongest news photos of the day, taken by AP photographer Martin Meissner, and it's not just a beautiful image. It captures the last wild horse herd in Germany being driven into an arena where the young stallions are separated so the herd can stay manageable and avoid fighting and inbreeding. It's a centuries-old practice, and the photo somehow makes all of that feel immediate. From there, we're going to the Strait of Hormuz, where the US and Iran are trying to turn a shooting conflict into a negotiated deal, while both sides still toy with tolls, control, and leverage over global trade. Then we'll get into Gaza and Lebanon, where the word ceasefire is still doing a lot of work it can't fully carry. After that, we'll hit the US boat strike in the Caribbean, because the administration is once again using military force in a way that raises ugly questions about evidence and due process. We'll also touch the Maryland primary and the Colombia election site, where money, foreign influence, and political branding are all colliding in ways that should make voters uneasy. And yes, we'll finish with a million bees on an interstate and a quick summer heat note, because apparently the news insists on being both serious and completely ridiculous at the same time. If you're getting value from this, hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss what's next. Let's start with the photograph, because sometimes a single frame tells you more than a paragraph of explainer text ever could. AP's Martin Meissner photographed the annual horse catch in Münsterland in western Germany, where the last remaining herd of wild horses in the country is brought into an arena once a year. The purpose is practical, not romantic. The herd is kept to roughly 400 hectares, so the stallions are separated out to prevent territorial fights and inbreeding. The younger stallions are later sold to horse lovers who tame them into working horses. That's the human version of the story. The visual version is all motion. Meissner shot from above with a Sony Alpha 1 Mark II and a 300mm lens using a fast shutter to freeze the herd as it poured forward. And the reason the image works is obvious the second you see it. There isn't empty space to relax into. Horses fill the frame from front to back. The manes streak like brushstrokes. It feels wild, but also contained, which is probably why it hits so hard. And there's a deeper tension there that runs through today's news. Wild things don't stay wild forever once people decide they need a fence, a toll, a permit, or a policy. Sometimes that's for safety, sometimes it's for order, sometimes it's for power, and sometimes, to be blunt, it's just bureaucracy wearing a polite shirt. That brings us to the Strait of Hormuz, where the same struggle is playing out on a much larger scale, with oil, shipping, and geopolitics instead of horses. The Strait of Hormuz is one of those places the entire global economy only remembers when it starts to break. After the US and Iran signed an interim deal aimed at ending the war that choked off oil flows and helped drive inflation, ship traffic has picked up. But picked up is doing a lot of work here. It is still below normal, and the route is still tense enough that ships are taking the longer and more cautious paths. Here's the part that should make everybody nervous. Both Washington and Tehran are acting like the strait is something they can simply manage from their side of the table. Iran's parliamentary speaker Mohammad Bagher Khalibaf says the waterway will be managed by Iran in line with international law. Meanwhile, Trump has floated the idea that the US could slap on its own tolls for services rendered, which sounds less like a serious maritime policy and more like a tax idea someone blurted out after a long lunch. That matters, because freedom of navigation is not supposed to work like a toll road. The basic international principle is transit passage. Ships move through natural straits without being shaken down every time they cross a choke point. The UN treaty that codified that rule says fees belong in ports or in very specific service arrangements, not as an all-purpose ransom note for one of the world's most important shipping lanes. Now, the US and Iran are not both treaty members, and that gives everyone some room to argue. But the legal point is still pretty simple. If major powers start treating open waterways like private driveways, global trade gets more expensive, less stable, and more political. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent says the US has now issued a temporary 60-day license allowing Iranian oil sales while talks continue. At the same time, the administration is signaling that Iran will allow IAEA inspectors back in, while Iranian officials deny some of the details being promoted in Washington. That's the other recurring theme here. Everybody is announcing progress before the ink is dry. And ship tracking data shows why caution is still the word of the day. Vessels are moving through Hormuz, but many are sticking to narrower routes or masking their transponders. That's not confidence, that's hesitation. So yes, the photo of horses in Germany is about motion and control. Hormuz is too, except the price tag is measured in inflation, energy security, and the entire supply chain, instead of a single herd. Now to the part of the day where the language gets even more loaded. In Gaza, Palestinian health authorities and local reporters say an Israeli strike on a car in Gaza City killed a high school student, Ragad Ashur, as she was on her way to take final exams. They say several others were wounded, and that the strike came amid a continuing pattern of ceasefire violations. Reuters carried the image, Al Jazeera pushed the broader narrative, and both things can be true at once. The image is real, and the framing around it is clearly coming from a source that has its own strong point of view. That's worth saying out loud, because too many outlets present emotionally charged language as if it were neutral reporting. It isn't. And in this war, words are almost always loaded before the facts are even finished arriving. Still, The underlying reality is grim enough without the rhetorical inflation. Gaza's health ministry says more than 1,000 Palestinians have been killed and thousands more wounded since the so-called ceasefire deal was signed last year, while Israeli forces have also pushed deeper into territory they were supposed to stop taking. Those claims need scrutiny, as all wartime figures do, but the broader picture is hard to ignore. The ceasefire is not behaving like a ceasefire. In Lebanon, the same pattern keeps leaking across the border. Reports say Israel is still debating limited withdrawals, while Netanyahu insists forces will remain in a security zone for as long as necessary. Hezbollah has hit back, peacekeepers have been wounded, medics and activists have been killed, and the US and Iran are now talking about a deconfliction cell, which is a very diplomatic way of saying nobody trusts the other side to keep the peace without supervision. That matters because the Hormuz talks are tied directly to whether Israel stops widening the war in Lebanon. So the Iran deal is not just about nuclear issues or shipping, it's about whether the region can stop layering one conflict on top of another. And from a plain American standpoint, it is fair to ask why US taxpayers keep getting pulled into policing every edge of this mess while the public gets slogans instead of clarity. The Caribbean boat strike is the next red flag. US Southern Command says it bombed another alleged drug-running boat, killing at least 2 people and leaving 6 survivors. That alone should raise immediate questions. If there are survivors, then we are not talking about a clean, impossible-to-misunderstand battlefield. We are talking about people in the water after a military strike, and that means search, rescue, evidence, and lawful process matter a lot. The administration has been calling these victims narco-terrorists, which is a convenient label if you want to make due process disappear behind branding. The Intercept, which is openly hostile to the strike campaign, says the broader operation has already involved dozens of attacks and hundreds of deaths. That figure should be treated carefully because the outlet has a strong editorial angle, but the basic criticism still stands. The US government has not really explained the legal standard it thinks it is using here, or why summary execution at sea is suddenly supposed to be normal. If this is supposed to be about law and order, then maybe the law should show up before the missiles do. A similar theme shows up in Maryland, where a local race for a congressional seat has become a billboard for outside money. AIPAC and crypto-linked donors have poured millions into the contest, and now local leaders are scrambling to consolidate against Adrian Boafo. You can see the problem immediately. An open seat in Prince George's County should be about voters, not about who can assemble the biggest bundle of national donor cash and polished campaign consultants. That is not democracy. That is an auction with yard signs. Then there's Colombia, where outgoing leftist President Gustavo Petro is alleging foreign interference, vote manipulation, and bias from both Israel and the United States, after a razor-thin loss by right-wing candidate Abelardo de la Espriella. The official election authorities say they see no evidence of fraud so far, and that matters. But the bigger point is that foreign influence allegations are now part of the political language across the Western Hemisphere, and when your election is tight, every outside endorsement becomes a live grenade. Trump endorsed de la Espriella, Netanyahu congratulated him. Petro says that proves his point. Whether or not that allegation holds up, it does tell you something about how openly international politics is being dragged into domestic elections now. Not every story today is geopolitical, thankfully. In Tennessee, a truck carrying about 1 million bees crashed on an interstate ramp, forcing travelers to stop while the swarm was cleared and the truck was removed. Nobody was injured, which is the part that matters most. But the rest of the story is exactly why local news still deserves a place in the feed. It is impossible not to laugh at the puns, and impossible not to appreciate the people who had to solve the problem in real time. And as summer heat settles in, a quick practical note from the AC explainer in today's stack. Air conditioning cools by pulling heat and moisture out of the air, which is great until it dries out your skin, eyes, nose, and throat. So drink water, don't sit under a vent all day, and remember that heat stroke is not a joke. The more electricity gets treated like a luxury instead of basic infrastructure, the more these little details become life and death details. That's the hidden link between bees, heat, war, and shipping. Systems only look abstract until something breaks close enough to your front door. So the big picture today is pretty clear. 1. The AP horse photo works because it captures tension between nature and control in a single frame. 2. The Hormuz talks are a fragile experiment in managing a global choke point without turning it into a toll booth. 3. The war in Gaza and Lebanon is still not really settled, no matter how often officials use the word ceasefire. 4. The US boat strike in the Caribbean raises serious questions about due process and executive power. And 5. Money, influence, and foreign entanglements are still warping politics from Maryland to Colombia. In other words, the headlines look random, but the pattern is not random at all. If you made it this far, you clearly care about the details, not just the headlines. So leave a comment with the story you think matters most today: the horses, Hormuz, Gaza, or the boat strike, and tell me which one you think is getting the most spin. And if you want a daily news breakdown that cuts through the noise, hit like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.